Hey everyone, for those of you who haven't been here before, my name is Derek Royden. I write for a website called nationofchange.org. You can check out my articles there or link to them through the blog here if you're on the blog. You can find a link to the blog if you're on YouTube just below. One thing I wanted to mention this week was I added a sidebar. You can just click on the little squares up at the top of right hand side of the page. And there's links to some of the websites we talk about here every once in a while. If you want to go check out Black Agenda Report, the news is from a very strong African American left perspective. I think it's really great. There's the LRB, there's a number of other places. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to talk first about the midterms in the United States, and then of course we're going to talk about the 100th anniversary of the Great War in Europe, the First World War, and kind of what its legacy is today with the U.S.-led wars going on pretty much in the center and center east of the world. But first, we're going to talk about these midterms because it was it felt at first very disappointing. There was kind of the hope was high that there would be this huge blue wave, and that Donald Trump, who was really awful throughout this campaign. I mean, he started out talking about mobs of Democrats during the Kavanaugh thing, and then he went on to talk about a caravan of like 5,000 people traveling from Central America, as if it was an invading force. It was just a really, really, really bad environment that was created, and many of us had hoped that this kind of talking, this kind of speech wouldn't necessarily work. But unfortunately, it looks like with a large number of people, maybe more than a lot of us thought, this kind of hatred is a really powerful motivating factor and got a lot of people out to vote. Now, having said that, the results have somewhat seemed to shift a little bit in the wake of the election. There's a lot of recounts and a lot of things going on, so it's good to keep an eye on that. And also, if you look at the results of the ballot measures, which are the kind of referenda that each state have or can have, like there was one in Georgia which re-enfranchised 104 million people who had lost their right to vote due to a felony conviction. There were, of course, the usual marijuana ballot initiatives. Many of them passed, both recreational and medical in some places. There were a few environmentally focused pieces or ballot measures that, I mean, the big oil companies, big energy companies threw $100 million. It was in 3 different places. I can't remember exactly where offhand, and I honestly, I can't remember what the measures were, but I believe that all 3 of them were overturned. So big money can have an influence on this, but when we look at, we're also a bunch of referenda on the minimum wage and raising the minimum wage to make it a living wage, usually $15 being what they were looking for, and these passed. So we see that when voters are engaged and it's an issue that they can understand and that concerns them, the people are actually very progressive or very left-wing. There's kind of a weird team sport spirit to American politics that's only been kind of heightened under the Trump administration, but I mean, it was always there, the fight between the Democrats and the Republicans. And one thing I'll agree with a lot of online commentators, that Democrats are just absolutely terrible at strategy, terrible at listening to the concerns of their voters. They're really, really bad with taking corporate money. And in this particular election cycle, one good thing was that a few different groups, the Democratic Socialists of America, Our Revolution, which is under the banner of Bernie Sanders, and Justice Democrats, all put people forward, quite a few of whom won, with really progressive platforms and who did not take corporate money. And this is a big thing. Like, this is also, should be very important in Canadian politics as well. There's far too much money funneled into politics in order to, ensure particular results. So, like I say, the midterms were a bit of a mixed bag. Some of the big wins that were hoped for, like for example, getting the awful Ted Cruz out of office, just didn't happen. But I mean, there's always hope for the future. And like I said, these small numbers of Justice Democrats, if they live up to, it's possible that they could be co-opted by the culture in Washington. But if they live up to their campaign promises and a plan to really kind of get together once they're there. I mean, it's a really small number of people, but it will be possible to grow this. There is, a desire for populism on the left to combat the populism on the right, and the problem that the left populism faces is that the left generally just doesn't have the same resources as the right does, or even the center right, like represented by like your normal Democrats like Hillary Clinton or Nancy Pelosi. The left relies on its own people for funding, so it can be very difficult to kind of build the kind of mass movement that we want to see. But we have to keep chipping away at it. Just as like every week I produce an article for a website that does not take any advertising money, that does, it relies entirely on its readers. So it's a small and growing voice on the progressive left, and hopefully not just in the United States, but here in Canada. And I know that some people in Europe have read my stuff there before. So, there is hope. That this movement can be built, and it really does kind of need to start in the United States because it will give fuel to left populism in other countries, especially in this North American context. So the next part, just because it's the day before Memorial Day, there was an article up by the news editor at antiwar.com, Jason Ditz. He's a really good writer, just talking about a new report that fixes the number of people killed in Iraq, Afghanistan at 500,000 people. So, as we remember the stupidity and foolishness of the First World War, which that's what it was a bunch of cousins who got into an argument with each other, and mostly working people from around the world had to suffer and die for their stupidity. So, one of the reasons why I don't, I understand that there are different views on the First World War, but it is the most despicable form of government that still extant in the world is monarchy. These monarchs led to the deaths of thousands of people, and now you have people like Tony Blair and probably George W. Bush who are going to show up at memorial services, who are also men, part of an oligarchy rather than a monarchy, who sacrifice the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. It is not acceptable. Anyway, sorry, I got a little bit of passionate there. So, as Ditz writes, Brown University has released a new study on the cost in lives of America's post-9/11 wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. The study estimates between 480,000 and 507,000 people were killed in the course of the three conflicts. This includes combatant deaths and civilian deaths in fighting and war violence. Civilians make up over half of the roughly 500,000 killed, with both opposition fighters and U.S.-backed foreign military forces each sustaining in excess of 100,000 deaths as well. This is admittedly a dramatic underreport of the people killed in these wars, as it only attempts to calculate those killed directly in war violence, and not the massive numbers of other civilians who died from infrastructure damage or other indirect results of wars. The list also excludes the U.S. war in Syria, which itself stakes a claim to another 500,000 killed since 2011. Just reading that number, Syria was a prosperous country. I'm not a fan of the government there, never have been, but at least there was peace and this beautiful intertwining of different cultures and different religious cultures and ethnic groups was really a remarkable place, and has literally been, parts of it, whole cities have been destroyed. East Aleppo, Raqqa, Kobani and others, still lie in ruins. So the report also notes that over 60,000 US troops were either killed or wounded in the course of these wars. This includes 6,951 US military personnel killed in Iraq and Afghanistan since 9/11. It's not the fault of the soldiers. Soldiers in general, the troops in general, tend to be working people. It's the fault of the people who call for these wars, prosecute these wars, and sell and supply the governments that engage in these wars with the weapons that they are senselessly murdering people with, who are responsible. The troops deserve our respect. They're working people, and the left represents working people. The Brown study also faults the US for having done very little in the last 17 years to provide transparency to the country about the scope of the conflicts, concluding that they are inhibited by governments determined to paint a rosy picture of perfect execution and progress. It has not been a perfect picture. You just don't read about it because they don't want people to know about it. It's with climate change, the ongoing wars, which Canada is involved in, European countries are up to their noses in. With besides climate change, these are the major stories that are not being covered. If it wasn't for the killing of one man who knew a lot of very well-connected people, Jamal Khashoggi, we would not be talking about the war in Yemen. I've been talking about the war in Yemen for 3 years, and it wasn't until someone influential was killed that the Yemen war even became part of the general discussion, like that you would hear about it on a place like CNN or even really the CBC, although the CBC does do a much better job of covering international affairs. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit excited, so I'm going to call it a day. I thank you very much for watching, and I hope everyone has a great day, and always remember,